2 miles from downtown Seoul. Never saw a whiff of tear gas or a crowd the whole way. We were there for a week. They had 5 demonstrations while we were there, and we were told the closest one would be a 25, 30-minute taxi ride away. So relying on the news is probably what causes policymakers here to make dumb decisions sometimes. I'm sorry, but the news is not all that's happening. The news is a snapshot of an event in a larger frame. And when you have people on the ground who know the culture, who know the language, and who have the contacts, you can put the frame and the rest of the picture together and make better decisions.
In fairness, it's not just Americans. I was thinking, Charlie, that when I was in Afghanistan, Canadian press almost exclusively reported on Helmand, on Kandahar, because that's where the Canadians were. The British press almost exclusively on Helmand. American press on eastern Afghanistan, where the Americans, anything else in the rest of the country, I mean, first of all, they only reported things that went bang. Secondly, I can't tell you how many journalists have told me they had trouble getting their editors to run positive stories because those weren't interesting. But the third thing was that this function of report what people think. So, you know, if you're Canadian, you report on Kandahar. The hell with the other 33 provinces of Afghanistan. More questions.
Hi, I'm Samira Daniels. I am originally from Pakistan, but have lived abroad most of my life.
Mic's not working.
Turn on the mic, yeah.
It's on.
It's still not
Okay. I have a little different take on what has been going on. But my one question is, I still couldn't catch why there are fewer people going abroad, because when in the early part of the Bush administration, you know, there just seemed to be so many people that were going to Iraq and Afghanistan, and you know, we were all meeting with them. So that is one question if you can address. But the argument that I think is even stronger is that there seemed to be a gap and a different culture of the State Department in the 50s, 60s, and 70s vis-a-vis maybe post-80s. I'm just speculating there by saying it's post-80s. It's a very different, their understanding of history is different, because many of those people before the 70s, they were very fluent in languages. You know, they could speak, you know, Richard Fry, when I was in Iran, would be, you know, talking away with, and I think some of that is an issue as well, that they just do not know the languages. I mean, you have to stay in a country. Harold Brown, you know, was there in Iran for years. Richard Fry, equally the Uphems. So it was a very different culture. So I was wondering if you could respond. And what I meant by pointing to this cultural difference is that there is, you know, because of the media, there is this need to grab onto the sensationalist, as you say, the interesting story, which may not be what is really going on in that country. So I'm sorry to take so much time.
No, those are good questions.
I wrote about this in that article. You're right. What we've created over the past 40 years, and frankly, in my view, is a credit to the U.S. because people begin to imitate. We've got an English-speaking elite all over the world, and our embassies tend to gravitate to this. I remember going to a group of entrepreneurs, men and women in Saudi Arabia. They went to Yale. You know, the embassy. We wouldn't have seen that 30 or 40 years ago. But I bet you go to rural Saudi Arabia, and it's not being run by people that went to Yale. That's the gap. So we have to push against that, and I agree that's a problem. The other issue that we have is what I call, I learned this from my younger officers, the English entertainment bubble. When I was a junior officer, we watched the local programs. They were miserable, but you saw the language, you saw the culture, and now you watch, you know, you watch Netflix in the most remote corners of the world. So we have to push against that. But believe me, I talk to these younger officers all the time. And they have the skills. They want to use the skills. My example of Yemen, we had 2 young officers in Yemen. They had excellent Arabic. They'd been Fulbrighters. They knew people. They couldn't leave the embassy. So of course their skills are going to atrophy. And their contacts are going to atrophy too. So I think you have a valid point, but I also think the American Foreign Service is full of people who actually want to talk to foreigners, who want to know the language, and know something about foreign countries.
Yeah, I'm gonna be a little controversial here. I think the Foreign Service that you remember from the 50s and 60s still exists, but we're a minority in our embassies these days. You know, the sort of classic Foreign Service officers, you know, they tend to be, you know, a small demographic. There are many other agencies at posts these days, and, you know, particularly in the large, you know, I'm thinking Pakistan, you know, where we had a heavy emphasis on military issues, counterterrorism. Most of the people who worked there were not classic diplomats wearing suits like me. They were wearing cargo pants. You know, and there's a cultural difference that goes along with that. You know, it's not politically correct, but it's true.
But the other part of your question was, why aren't people getting out? And that is what we're talking about. That is a political decision of Washington, of our congressional leaders and our policy leaders, to prevent people getting out because they might get hurt and somebody will then be called to account. So yes, there is a difference, but it's not a cultural difference. And that's why we think it's important to talk to Congress about the need to accept more risk in our foreign policy. More questions?
Hi, Greg Delloway, retired Foreign Service officer, former ambassador. You all have talked a lot about our lack of information because we're having trouble getting out of the embassies. I'm wondering if you could take another step. Why do we care about this information? In my career, it's always been we care about the information so we can influence what's going on. And whether we're talking about drugs or nuclear weapons or whatever, you know, I think it's important to say not just that we're not understanding things as well as we should, but that we're not able to influence things in a way that suits American interests. Thank you.
Well, yeah, you're 100% correct. I mean, the purpose for getting out is not to satisfy the adrenaline needs of an adventure junkie, which I have to confess I probably am, but to achieve our policy goals. And just I'll use Cambodia as an example. I don't know. I'm always reluctant to ask this when I'm up here because a lot of people are too young to remember. How many of you are familiar with the PROTECT Act? That's what I thought. It's a piece of legislation that was passed back in the late 1990s, I believe, that allowed the prosecution in U.S. courts of American pedophiles who commit their acts abroad without having to prove that they had the intent to do it before leaving the U.S., which had been the case before, making it impossible to prosecute. When I went to Cambodia in 2002, there were, I think, 2 cases in Mexico, and we were having a hell of a time getting extradition processing. There was 1 case somewhere else. Shortly after my arrival, maybe 6 or 8 months, we got a case in Cambodia. We do not have an extradition treaty with Cambodia. Now, we're not talking physical risk here, but a political risk. When I arrived there, I took the political risk of offending certain people here in Washington by establishing a close relationship with the Prime Minister. And when I say close, I mean he and I played golf twice a month. He lived around the corner from me, and I didn't meet him in his office. I met him in his living room. That didn't go down very well with a lot of people back here who didn't particularly like him because he is a dictator. I mean, you know, he didn't argue that he was a dictator, nor would I. But because we played golf twice a month. When they finally did arrest an American for brutally sexually assaulting a 12-year-old boy, and I knew that this guy, who was the CEO of a small company, would buy his way out of court. On the golf course with the Prime Minister, I brought it up and I said, it would really be nice if we could get this guy in a U.S. court. And he says, how do we do it? I said, well, we got your approval, we'll work it out. And just if you take that and extend it to the physical, the point is I was willing, by being willing to risk incurring the ire of people here who didn't want to talk to people we don't like, we were able, the first 2 prosecutions under the PROTECT Act in this country, which were later confirmed by the Supreme Court, came out of a country we don't have an extradition treaty with. I'm not going to go into how I worked it out, but it was determined to be legal. And my point, though, is that by being there, by taking the risk of doing what others are afraid to do, you're able to carry out U.S. policy, to get done our policy aims, which you can't do by telephone, by Skype or Snapchat or whatever the hell these other things are, and you certainly can't do it from a fortified office. You do it by putting boots on the ground and eyeballs to eyeballs.
What is the use of this to the U.S.? Just to note what we have talked about today. In Sierra Leone, by taking risk, we advanced a democratic process. In Algeria, by taking risk, we were able to help convince President Carter not to join the French in supporting a thuggish regime. We talked about not being surprised by having governments, or the need not to be surprised by having a government overthrown, or find that we have got ourselves completely wrong-footed because we don't know what's going on in the country. And we talked about, briefly, about the fact that people are dying in the Congo today of Ebola, although we have human rights standards and reasons to want them protected because we can't deploy the teams which function on a basis of state leadership to protect them. Those are all U.S. interests in human rights, in democracy, in politics, all issues where you advance U.S. policy by getting out and accepting some measure of risk in order to carry policy forward. I should have mentioned that on the tables you have copies of an article Ambassador Patterson wrote quite recently on the subject that was in the Foreign Service Journal. I urge you to read it when it's not terribly long, but it is a very good statement of what's at issue. This is a subject that we will have to come back to, and I thank you for coming, and I thank you for listening to us, and I hope you will think about it. Thank you very much.